As an evangelist, I get invited into different churches and they will put on events and I'll come and speak at them. And I think 10, 12 years ago, it was almost a bait and switch thing in which you would put on a glitzy event and then Glen Scrivener would be kind of slotted in between rounds 3 and 4 of the pub quiz or whatever it was. You get people with the bait. And then the Christian bit was almost the nasty hook. And I think more and more people are realizing in a world that is utterly fragmenting, in some very vitriolic culture wars out there and a meaning crisis, that actually the proclamation of the Christian story is the bread that we're offering to the world.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
Well, I'm joined again on the show by Glen Scrivener as we continue and sort of really summarise the tour through Glen's new book, The Air We Breathe. We've been talking over the last several shows about the way Christianity birthed the scientific revolution, the idea of equality, the concept of compassion, and you can find many more of those concepts spelled out in detail and the history behind them in Glen's new book, The Air We Breathe. In a way, today sort of presents us with an opportunity to talk about, when we look at the ways in which Christianity has shaped the West, in ways people often don't realise, that they often, as the title of the book says, all the air we breathe, people just go around assuming that this is just the way things are and don't realise how radically their ideas have actually been shaped by the Jesus Revolution. You title the final chapter of the book "Choose Your Miracle." So what's that about? What's the kind of final challenge that you're levelling, both at Christians and non-Christians who may come across the book and start to engage with this idea of where all these ideas and concepts came from?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk through these issues. I think when I say choose your miracle, I'm saying non-miraculous accounts for the world are off the table. Everybody's got to deal with the miraculous. And of course, at that stage, people who don't believe in the supernatural are going to object. And I'm going to say at that point, very few of us live according to nature, red in tooth and claw. Very few of us just treat every other human that we encounter as a mischievous ape. All of us step out into the world, and it's a venture of faith to treat people better than their economic utility, to treat them better than what their social standing might suggest, to treat them with an inherent moral dignity and worth. Most people at least aspire to living like that. Most people aspire to living compassionate lives. And yet I'm saying that is supernatural. That is not what survival of the fittest would urge you to do. And yet you're living by a different kind of a moral. It is above nature. It is supernatural. And I'm saying, as you look around at a world that has been transformed by the Jesus Revolution, you don't really need to take a leap of faith. You're already midair. You're already 6 miles in the air, believing in compassion and equality and consent and enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. As you believe in these things, they are not the result of evidence and logic. They're the result of inhabiting a Christianized world. And at that point, either the Jesus who birthed that revolution is true, and the values that you hold have a grounding, or you are midair and you might just find yourself crashing down to earth. So I kind of got the title "Choose Your Miracle" from a conversation between Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson. And have you had Jonathan Pageau on Unbelievable, Justin?
I haven't actually had Jonathan Pageau on, though. We've talked a few times about bringing him on. Obviously, I had Jordan Peterson on the one occasion, and yeah, I'd love to get him though. He's a fascinating character. He's an Orthodox Christian. He carves icons, and he's obviously in the midst of some really interesting cultural theological discussions on his YouTube channel, isn't he?
Yes, and he's a friend of Jordan Peterson's, and I sort of raised Jordan Peterson in the chapter, not because I think necessarily Jordan Peterson is on Team Jesus, and not necessarily because I'm on Team Jordan Peterson, but just as um, an interesting bellwether for where the conversation is going culturally. And in this conversation, um, Jordan Peterson says, I've got the choice of believing two impossible things. I can either believe that the world is constituted so that God took on flesh and was crucified and rose 3 days later, or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that has stretched into every atom of culture, and it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first. Because the more you investigate the manifestations of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes. So Peterson is looking out at the world that has been built by the Jesus Revolution, and he's like, well, I've got two miraculous accounts for that. Either it really happened, and the reason why that figure on the cross has made our world is because he is in fact our maker, so I guess that makes sense, or that is a story that was invented by humans, and yet the story of a crucified God is a preposterous story, which nevertheless has triumphed in order to make the modern world. On both accounts, you're believing in the miraculous. And I'm basically saying in this chapter, as I round the book off, which miracle are you going to choose? Because all non-miraculous options are off the table.
That's what often is the objection to people who object to Christianity. They say, I can't believe in all this miraculous stuff about virgin births and Jesus rising from the dead and angels and so on. It sounds like actually what you're saying, though, is that we all start with a worldview, let's say, a perspective from which we're going to be judging the evidence around us, and that secular people are no less sort of coming at things from a specific worldview where they've made certain assumptions about the way the world is. And I suppose in the end, I mean, a lot of what I've found with the apologetics and Unbelievable that I've done is that it's as much about asking tough questions about their worldview and how they would justify their belief in dignity, equality, compassion, science, whatever it is, right, from a purely atheistic, naturalistic point of view. And asking, well, does your view of reality fit better than the Christian view of reality? And maybe actually there's things about the Christian view of reality that actually segue better, that are more consistent with it. So is that kind of where you're going with this sort of idea of choose your miracle? I suppose we've all got a miraculous element to the things we believe about the world.
Right. And if you believe in compassion, let's say, then you're believing in something that's supernatural. It is not natural. You are not determining to treat other people as though they're mischievous apes, but to treat them with a compassion that is utterly Christ-like. And historically, we can trace back where that came from. I mean, I debated Bart Ehrman on the Unbelievable show with you, Justin, and he was very happy to say, yes, compassion, for instance, is a unique gift of Christianity to the world. Bart Ehrman is a massive skeptic of Christianity, and yet his knowledge of the ancient world and his knowledge of the early church has led him to say, yeah, this has come from the Jesus Revolution. And so I just want people to press into the fact that they live according to a story, the details of which they have forgotten. And actually, the other story that they tell you they believe in is not the story that they actually lean into for most of their waking life. The story they tell you they believe in is that they are a biological survival machine. The story they lean into, the story that they inhabit minute by minute, is a story that says society should be judged by how they treat the least strong members. They live into a world in which they say taking in refugees from Ukraine is a good thing, and Putin is wrong to invade Ukraine. They live in a world, in a moral universe that has been built by Christianity, and yet they say that they live in a godless universe up here, in which actually the details of their life don't make sense. And I'm calling people out. Everybody is a believer. Absolutely everybody's a believer. And one of the ways that you can see that you're a believer is that you might well object to the church, and instead of believe, and you might think that the church is unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, regressive and anti-freedom. And what do you notice about those accusations of the church? They assume the 7 values that the church have given to the world. So I think Christianity has become so immense that even our criticisms of Christianity are Christian criticisms. And I just want to press into the fact that we are all people of faith, and we all have these gut-level moral intuitions. Do you really want to believe that they have erupted from the deceit of, first century followers of Jesus who invented this preposterous story and somehow it took over the world? Or do you want to think that as I pull on these 7 values, I find that there's something solid at the other end of them, that there really is a grounding for compassion and equality and all those things?
And you talk about the fact that we kind of are living in a story, but we've forgotten the details of it. And I understand that, because I think that every time I see someone getting passionate about some issue of justice online, and maybe some Twitter spat over identity, race, LGBT, whatever, it feels like that person has a kind of quasi-religious belief almost. In fact, the way that so often these things are debated so passionately that it feels like people have some sense that this is a sacred thing, that, even if they don't call themselves a Christian or have any, conventionally religious beliefs. So it feels like, as you say, whether they like it or not, we're kind of religious about the things that matter most, aren't we?
Yes, we can't help but be. So I think the idea that we could live godless lives without some conception of a highest good that actually stands over us, I just don't think it's psychologically tenable, let alone spiritually tenable. And what do we find when we're on the internet late at night and, your wife says, come to bed, and you say, no, but somebody's wrong on the internet? Like that whole thing it's very preachy. We want to enlighten other people, right? We want to take them out of darkness and bring them into the light that we have found. It's proselytizing, it's evangelistic, it's Christian, And I think one of the dangers at the moment is that is not that we're becoming so licentious, is that we're becoming so legalistic, actually. Dostoevsky said, without God, everything is permissible. But I think what we're finding in the early 21st century is that without God, everything is preachy, very, very preachy. And the reason is we've got all these values. We've got kingdom values, but not a king. And so we're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references, and it's becoming incredibly fraught. Even though we claim to be irreligious, we're cancelling people, which is a kind of excommunication. We're declaring people to be phobes, which is a kind of a heresy charge. And we cannot escape this religious state that we're in. I've always ruminated on C.H. Spurgeon's line. He said, if you have half a Christianity, you'll be the most miserable creature on earth. And he was applying that to the individual level. If you just believe there's a lawgiver, but no actual forgiveness, you'll be absolutely miserable. And I think at a cultural level, we've come to this stage, actually. We have the values. We have these Christian-ish values that are above us, but we don't have the one who embodies them, and we don't have forgiveness for all the ways that we fail these values. I fail these values every day. And I don't just need values. I need somebody to forgive me. And so, my real prayer is that people will pull at the thread of these values. They'll find the person who embodies them, and they'll find the Savior who can forgive us for all the ways that we fail at these values, because we all do.
Do you think the tide is beginning to turn at all? Are you running into people who are kind of getting tired of kind of the secular version of religion, which is often so graceless and which frustrating and so on, and realizing actually maybe there is a God out there that actually I've been looking for? I've certainly run into one or two stories that feel a bit like that, and you get the sense that, as you've said, the Petersons and so on seem to be speaking to that kind of crowd who are kind of just fed up with the culture wars and everything else, and looking for something more substantial, a real God rather than a kind of half-baked demigod, that people often gather around.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And I think, and churches are starting to wake up to this. As an evangelist, I get invited into different churches and they will put on events and I'll come and speak at them. And I think 10, 12 years ago, it was almost a bait and switch thing in which you would put on a glitzy event and then Glen Scrivener would be kind of slotted in between rounds 3 and 4 of the pub quiz or whatever it was. You get people with the bait. And then the Christian bit was almost the nasty hook. And I think more and more people are realizing in a world that is utterly fragmenting, some very vitriolic culture wars out there, and a meaning crisis, that actually the proclamation of the Christian story is the bread that we're offering to the world. And we don't have to do a bait and switch. We've got bread, and we've got this nourishing story of the Christ who embodies equality and compassion and consent and enlightenment and all these values that we so love, and who dies for those who fail. And I think it's an unforgiving world at the moment. And if you say words on social media that just 5 years ago everybody was saying, suddenly you are persona non grata. You are excommunicated from the church of acceptable speech, and people are feeling very anxious about all of that, very defeated by all of that. And we have a Jesus who doesn't just embody the values. He comes with his arms wide open for the world and says, come on home to live into a kingdom. The heir of this kingdom really is forgiveness, it's mercy, it's compassion. Come home to that story.
And just as we finish this conversation then, Glenn, how if people are still hungry, if people are still innately religious in that sense, but maybe they're looking in the wrong places, what practically could we go out and do? What can the church be doing in this cultural moment to remind people actually that the story they believe has its roots in the greatest story ever told, as it were. And how do we draw people kind of both to be reminded of that, but also to kind of ultimately see that at the center of this is a person called Jesus Christ, who kind of answers all of those ultimate questions that so often people are looking in other places to try and answer.
Yeah, well, I think where the book ends up is just an invitation to consider how improbable the Christian Revolution is, given that its founder dies in the most ignominious way the Romans could devise, and yet on that weekend there was a big bang that explains the expanding universe of Christendom that has happened for the last 2,000 years. It's a very improbable source of such a revolution, and it's also a predicted revolution. There is the Old Testament scriptures speaking of how the kingdom will absolutely go global and the Messiah is going to come, and then Jesus says in his distinctive northern accent, with Roman soldiers scoffing on the fringes of the crowd, that my church will not fail, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. My movement will be like a mustard seed growing into the biggest plant in the garden. It will be like yeast working its way through a batch of dough. And you just think, who are you? You're like, if Jesus was living today, he'd be the equivalent of, I don't know, a car mechanic from rural Ukraine. That's who a carpenter from Nazareth is in the modern world. He is a car mechanic from rural Ukraine, and he ends up in godforsaken execution. And somehow he turned that into world domination. He's like, well, that's a miracle. All right, choose your miracle. The water into wine has got nothing on this. How do you go from godforsaken execution to world domination? He pulled it off, and he predicted it in advance. What do you make of this Jesus? And then in conversations with people who are interested in any way, I'd just say crack open a gospel and encounter this Jesus who, he's got a towering personality, he's got a stooping love. You will see the source of all those things that you value so very supremely. And as you look to that one on the cross, if you start to think to yourself, he's it, that is the source of all this, that is ultimate, that is the vision of God, that is the vision of what it means to be human. At that stage, you're basically saying Jesus is Lord, and bad luck, you're a Christian. That's kind of how it happens, and it sneaks up on you, and sorry, but that's how it works. So get into the Gospels and keep reading them. Church, like, I could be heard to be saying, given that the world is Christian-ish, maybe the church should be world-ish, right? That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying the Christian revolution has overtaken the world precisely by us being weird, by us being countercultural. And what does it mean today to stand against infanticide and abortion? What does it mean today to stand up for the rights of women? What does it mean today to stand up for the rights of the oppressed and to truly believe in compassion, to truly believe in equality, to truly believe in freedom? We are to be at the vanguard of the Jesus revolution in a weird way that the world won't initially understand. Continue to be weird, but continue to have confidence that the Jesus revolution really is taking over the world. The Church of Jesus Christ is bigger today than it was yesterday, and it'll be bigger again tomorrow. It's happening. This car mechanic from rural Ukraine, this carpenter from Nazareth has built the world, and he's continuing to build the world. So just have the confidence that what we have in proclaiming Jesus is not backwards and regressive and restrictive and unequal and cruel. It is the good news that has built our world, and it will continue to build our world if we have the courage to continually proclaim it. So let's get out there proclaiming it.
Glen, thank you so much for being with me on the show today. If you want to get hold of Glen's book, there is a link with today's show where you can find The Air We Breathe and indeed Speak Life, the organisation that Glen heads up. But for now, thanks so much for being my guest over the last 4 episodes of the show, Glen.
It's been a privilege. Thank you so much, Justin.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.